Have you ever bought a beautiful cake and found out that it's entirely fondant? Have you ordered hot curry and it came out mild? Have you ever watched the most expensive show in history, but discovered that the writers and showrunners were sourced from a flaming dumpster that just happened to be nearby? Let's talk about The Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power. Spoiler warning, full spoilers ahead. But first, who am I to talk? I'm not an influencer trying to peddle you something. Making videos or reviewing things is not my profession. I will never make a cent off of this channel. I'm not an Amazon shill nor a troll with vitriol against anything with a whiff of wokeness. While anyone who dislikes the show is apparently being labeled as a sexist, racist, whatever, I actually consider myself a feminist, for whatever that means in this day and age. I'm a fan of fantasy media, and when something inflames my passions, I must say something about it. Another difference between other reviewers is that I don't care about Tolkien and the official canon. I love the Lord of the Rings trilogy, was meh about the Hobbit trilogy as far as movies goes, and I never finished the books. What I know about the lore is from the Peter Jackson movies and just general cultural osmosis. As far as changing lore and characters, I think changing things in your adaptation is perfectly fine, so long as it makes it better, makes it more interesting, enriches the lore, expands upon shallow areas, etc., then you're golden. If the output is high quality, then I don't care what the ghost of Tolkien would have thought about it. However, if your adaptation is not high quality, if it does not improve the story and the setting, and then we look back at the canon and show that it would have been better if you just stuck with the source material, then we have a problem. And we do have a problem. Some caveats. For the $250 million Amazon spent, they did not get the rights to the Silmarillion, just the appendices. Would it have been better if they could draw from the actual stories told, instead of tiptoeing around the names of people? If they did not have to make so much original plot and content, could they have made a show with realistic characters, some sense of scale, or a more interesting arc? Was the Tolkien estate being greedy, or wisely protectful, in withholding the Silmarillion? I would like to imagine that if they could actually tell the stories of the Silmarillion, then this would have been a better outcome. But considering the mutilated butchery Amazon made of the Wheel of Time, this may be giving them far too much credit. Now let's talk about the good of this show, the things that I liked. First and foremost, it looks amazing, fantastic, pristine. A good number of the shots in this series clearly had a lot of care put into them by the artists who were responsible. As well, I loved Elrond and Prince Durin's relationship, probably the highlight of the series. There were a lot of scenes between them and also Princess Disa that felt real to me, like real people living in their situation could potentially have had a conversation as they did. I also liked Adar and the orcs. I think adding this kind of moral complexity actually betrays Tolkien's black and white morality, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. As well, I liked Gandalf, the beginning. The idea of a nascent demigod learning how to navigate the world after having been freshly incarnated was an interesting concept to explore. It stretched it out a lot, but I liked the idea of it and learning how the Astari start. Now the bad. There's a lot to go over here, so I'm gonna pick some things in each part of the scope of this show that bother me the most and just do one thing at a time. Now, at the smallest scope, a single character. Other videos nitpick Galadriel at length, and this is all I'm going to say about her. I don't mind that she is a master swordsman. If you are 3,000 years old and you haven't mastered a great breadth of skills by then, especially whilst having been at war for centuries, then it strains credulity if she didn't know how to handle herself in a fight. Gandalf is known for being a wizard, but the majority of his fighting is with a sword and staff. Now, what is bizarre to me is that for someone of her age and command experience, she is remarkably tone-deaf and tactless. There's no way she would have accomplished the social feats that she did if the plot did not demand it. Also, I was under the impression that she was one of the most magically powerful elves on Middle-earth, on par with Gandalf and Saruman, and we don't see any magic at all from her. Just kind of strange. It just seems to me that if you're going to feature an elf that is the exact opposite of later Galadriel's temperament and fighting methodology, perhaps just use a different elf? Galadriel's daughter, perhaps. And then that would give you a romance subplot with Elrond to boot. It seems rather insincere to say that you respect Tolkien whilst turning Galadriel into her mirror opposite. This feels like a decision made to intentionally make Tolkien fans enraged. Galadriel is the calmest, most patient, most discerning character in the whole of the Lord of the Rings trilogy, and having her be this raging juvenile asshole is baffling. If you want an impetuous sword-wielding firebrand protagonist, Galadriel is the last person in Tolkien's canon that you should use. Now for the sociopathic Harfoot tribe. I'm gonna say they should have died off. Straight up. They have no weapons, no way to defend themselves, they are not well adapted to their lifestyle or their environment. Their strategy is to hide from anyone and anything. But what happens when they're on the move and come across anything else? Hunter-gatherers had this whole migration thing figured out 20,000 years ago. Important to note in the name, hunter-gatherers. In the world of Middle-earth, there are monsters, and if you can't defend yourself, you die. Violence is not the answer, sure, but that doesn't mean you can afford to forego self-defense. When they encountered 3 wolves, they were completely helpless. Granted that the point of the scene was to be rescued by Gandalf, because he can throw a punch and they can't. But how did they survive before this? They would be dead, they should be dead. In the language of cinema, we are shown that this tribe is supposed to be the heart of the series, the moral center point on which the nascent Gandalf learns his moral compass from. And they're shit. Their culture is shit. This tribe is about 40 people, which means that you know everyone's names. You've eaten and traveled with them every single day of your life. You have never once talked to anyone outside of your tribe. You're all related to each other, since the tribe is so small. If one of you gets a twisted ankle, would you exile them from the tribe and their immediate family? Would you leave a full 10% of your tribe to die off? Well, the Harfoot sure would. Realistically, in a tribe of this size and level of helplessness, you cannot afford to abandon one of your men who is still in his prime. We've established that the women do not do the manual labor in this tribe. That's how he got a twisted ankle in the first place. The show makes a point of showing that the women call the men to do the heavy lifting. So let's think for just a second. Why don't they just slow down the caravan if it's going to be such a problem? What's the worst that can happen if you get to your tiny apple grove late? Will the 6 apple trees walk away? You have carts, just put him on a cart until he can walk again. Nori's goodbye scene doesn't make any sense since they are not a close-knit community. Everyone was totally okay with never seeing Nori and her family again just the previous day. The source of tension for the Harfoots for the majority of the series is whether they would fall too far behind the caravan and be lost. So when Nori's father, who is specifically the one being left behind, gives a speech about how they have hearts bigger than our feet, and they stick together and support each other, I can only watch with open-mouthed bafflement, since just 2 episodes earlier, the other Harfoots were conspiring to take the wheels off of his cart because his family was not falling behind fast enough. Adar, the leader of the orcs, cares more about his orcs than the Harfoot chief cares about his people. At least they're consistent about this. When the Harfoot chief gets stabbed in the stomach, they expend exactly 0 effort in trying to do anything about it. No treating the wound, no nothing. Nori has seen Gandalf perform healing upon himself, but she doesn't even ask. Sadoc just decides to put himself down like a horse. The showrunners do not have a strong understanding of ethics. They want to demonstrate that the Harfoot tribe is ethical in how peaceful they are. But the kind of fangless non-resistance that the Harfoot show is not virtue. Virtue is when you have the capacity to use force, but abstain and choose peace instead. Weakness is when you can't. They behave as they do because they are weak and selfish, not because they are virtuous. Now let's expand our scale a bit and talk about scale. The world is tiny, and the diversity therein is out of scope with the size. Now in episode 8, Halbrand rides from Mordor to Lindon, and then walks back to Mordor. According to the official map released by Amazon, that's 2,000 miles each way, give or take. That's approximately the walk between Los Angeles, California, and Pensacola, Florida. I guess you can simply walk into Mordor since Halbrand made Frodo's whole journey twice in one episode. Now, the Harfoots are a 40-member, isolationist, xenophobic tribe. And the thing about isolationist, xenophobic tribes is that they tend not to have a lot of genetic diversity. Now, it's perfectly fine that a few of them are black. No problem with me there. The problem is that they should all be black, every last one. Where is this diversity coming from if meeting someone from outside the tribe will get you exiled? This is a tribe that fears the other. When it comes to Numenor, the Numenorian army, the whole 300 people, is doing their sword training in the middle of the town square, surrounded by vendors and merchants. The same town square the queen used to give a speech? God, for such an impressive civilization, surely they have barracks, or just a plain old field to train in, and a separate stadium to give speeches in? Your trainees should not be doing their exercises in the street using live steel. Just absolutely everything about that scene was nonsensical. The Southlands. Oh my god, the Southlands. Never mind about Galadriel's plan of swimming 4,000 miles from Valinor to Middle-earth. Let's talk about the Southlands. So there's like 4 huts, 2 inns. The scale of this place just does not make sense. There are so few people in the Southlands that calling Halbrand their king is bizarre. A king implies a kingdom, a population large enough to require and sustain a system of government involving knights, nobility, taxes, a capital, a castle. By the authority vested in the office of the king and the infrastructure thereof, a king can make a decree, and his people will hear and obey. Halbrand is not a king by any meaningful implication of what a king's authority can command. I would hardly call him a mayor. There are no great cities, or cities at all, in the Southlands, so there's no form of centralized government. The Southlanders didn't have a king for 1,000 years. They lived in anarchy as far as I can tell. So when your local florist has to take the reins of leadership, there is a serious power vacuum in your social structure. The scale of the Southlands is so small that calling anyone the king of it is just meaningless and laughable. As a side note, people criticize that the Southlanders never had a king for 1,000 years, so then why wouldn't anyone bring it up when Halbrand arrived? I'll give them some credit here. I'm going to say that he declared himself king in the traditional way. I have an army, so I am king. Any objections? Say, if my hovel got destroyed by orcs and I'm a villager being besieged, and then this random guy no one's ever seen before shows up with an army and saves the day, I'd be totally like, yeah, whatever you say, chief. Long live the king. Strength to the king. Now, a funny side effect of the Southlands being only one tiny hovel is that when the Numenorians arrive on shore and charge 600 miles straight to a place that none of them have ever heard of before, is that as a viewer, it kind of makes sense in the moment, because Where else could they go? Where else would they go? In 1,000 years, the Southlands have only ever managed to produce this one village. So when the Numenorians charge in with millennia-old information, remember, they have not coordinated with the Southlanders whatsoever, then they arrive exactly on time to exactly the right place. How convenient. Overall, this show is plagued with mystery boxes. A show should stand on its own without outside knowledge to keep you going. This whole series completely relies on mystery boxes to keep you watching, not actual plot or anything interesting happening. The showrunners are stooges of J.J. Abrams. That's how they got the job, without any experience. Who's Hellbrand? Who's Sauron? Who's the old hobo? Who's Eminem? Keep watching for 9 hours and find out. It's a mystery in the worst way, in that it's just withholding information until the end for shock value. I hate mystery box writing so much. Character development and relationships are kept stagnant and stale for the sake of keeping the mystery a secret, even though these relationships are crucial to the plot. The character development gained through these relationships is way more interesting and satisfying than the mystery would be. If you know the answer to the mystery, and the mystery box is all that's keeping you watching the show, then it has no rewatchability. If people can guess your ending, that doesn't mean you failed as a writer. That means that your plot is comprehensible, and your foreshadowing makes sense. If you're at the 90% mark of your series and people are joking that Isildur's horse is Sauron, you've lost the plot. The writers don't do anything in the first half of the series, and then cram absolutely everything into the final episode. I'm having Wheel of Time Vietnam flashbacks here. They don't do anything in the first half of the series, and then cram absolutely everything into the final episode. Episode 8 really irritated me, because it confirmed that we've been watching 7 episodes of filler and 1 episode worth of content. Feminem and the Nazgul should have been terrorizing the Harfoots the entire season, like horror movie villains, just killing off Harfoots by shapeshifting into members of the tribe, so that the Harfoots are terrified, and afraid to even be alone in pairs. This would give them legitimate, real reasons to be suspicious of Gandalf. We could have gotten to empathize with these people, and seen them show courage in the face of danger, and actually gotten to perhaps even like them. We could have seen Sadok step up as a brave leader who puts himself at risk, and makes difficult decisions for the tribe, so that his death at the end of the first season is a meaningful loss. For Meteor Man, he should have been talking by episode 2. As I said before, I like him. I think he's interesting, and the quest of him discovering where he comes from and what the Valar have sent him to do is a great catalyst for an adventure story. Why didn't we get any of that the whole season? Instead, we're strung along with repetitive arguments and this "is he good or bad" mystery box, when he could have just declared, "I am good," early on, and then have an adventure trying to do good while learning to control his powers. There were a myriad of problems with the overall plot. Beginning with, the plot was clearly written backwards, and the characters were created by committee. Pay attention to the opening credits. 0 actors, 15 executive producers. 15. My god. Talk about too many chefs in the kitchen. Just try to imagine those meetings. These kinds of groups don't work to produce ideas that any of them like. They produce ideas that none of them hate. There's a big difference there. Just imagine you're in a boardroom with a highly energetic guy with an MBA, and he's showing you his pitch. We need a young Gandalf and a hobbit pair, a Gimli Legolas, enemies and a friends dynamic, a mysterious Aragorn kind of guy, and most importantly of all, an invincible warrior king with a twist. He's a woman. It's free money we cannot miss. And then the writers slot in characters according to these archetypes. So how they made this is You start off with where you want the characters to end up, and the set pieces you want to hit, and then connive how they got there. So the MBA guy, he's like, okay, so we need Celebrimbor, the greatest elven smith in history, to craft the rings for the elves, because otherwise they'll die. And he needs to have been helped by Sauron. Let's see how Sauron can help him. Then they watch like a single episode of Fortune Fire. Aha! Sauron knows what an alloy is, and Celebrimbor doesn't. Now, how to make alloys necessary? Mithril is rare, right? Let's say they need a ton of mithril. We'll make up a reason later. Okay, so, the dwarves have a ton of mithril, but they won't let the elves have any of it. We'll make another reason later, doesn't matter. Okay. And so on. So, the problem with writing your stories backwards is that your audience watches it forwards. And the logic doesn't always make sense when viewed from a perspective that has cause and effect. When your plot is a string of extraordinary coincidences bereft of logic, it makes for an experience that only the least critical MCU fans can enjoy. The characters do things because the plot demands it, not because it's something that they would actually do given the context or the character. Let's look at Durin's betrayal. So for context, they have been fighting Morgoth for centuries. There's mountains of elf corpses, generations of kinship between elves and dwarves. And now the elves are rotting away for some reason. But there is but one cure they found, and they're almost out of time. Mithril. It's a good thing their centuries-long allies have it in their minds, and in great abundance. So, the elves offer to trade the mithril, but the elder King Durin refuses completely, as the mines are not very stable, and they almost lost a couple of dwarven miners. King Durin could have been like, "We cannot risk dwarven lives, but you may mine it yourselves, in addition to giving us a whole boatload of tribute. Ho ho ho." So, this is the kind of win-win that you would expect from a savvy, perhaps greedy dwarf. By denying them any mithril at all, in this context, King Durin is effectively telling the elves, I want you to die, or leave Middle-earth forever. Now, with this, the dwarves effectively declare that they are no longer allies with the elves. They are wholly unwilling to help them in a matter of life or death. In a more character-focused show, like perhaps Game of Thrones, the result of this would be obvious. The elves will die without mithril. The dwarves have it and will not give it to them. Now, there are two viable options. The elves either leave Middle-earth, or they must take the mithril by force. If the plot were not written backwards, this decision would mean war between elves and dwarves. A betrayal on this level would be remembered by the elves forever. A prince should understand the geopolitical implications of this kind of decision, for his own kingdom and the people in general, and for every generation of dwarves until the end of time. Prince Durin should have immediately gathered a council of the other dwarven nobles to talk about how the king has either lost his mind or has fallen to the darkness, and it's time for him to get succeeded. Fortunately for them, the writers made Gil-galad a duplicitous coward in this version, so he decides to retreat off the continent and have the elves leave Middle-earth forever instead. Another example of backward storytelling is Adar and his sword hilt MacGuffin. Now, the orcs are pretty good at destroying things. They could have broken the dam themselves without having to fight and find and die for this ancient Rube Goldberg machine that could unlock the dam's sluice gates. They didn't have to fight the Southlanders at all. Just let them run away, while you build your canals and then bust up the dam yourself. If Adar is smart enough to come up with this plan to blow up Mount Doom, for the explicit purpose of giving the orcs a homeland because he is their leader, I'm sure he'd be smart enough to know that you don't need to rely on ancient mechanisms to get water out of a dam. Conversely, the Southlanders at some point know that Adar wants the sword hilt. Why did they just not send off Arondir with the hilt to Elf City, and then the rest of the people flee elsewhere? Why did the Southlanders make a stand at all? Orcs can't travel during the day. Surely they could have just retreated to an actual city with actual walls? Any city in the Second Age could have taken in the 60 villagers we saw as refugees, and certainly could have taken on the 60 orcs we saw. Abandoning a literal fort and then trying to shut yourself in an inn is so suicidally idiotic that I would have thought that whoever came up with the idea was a Morgoth spy. But we know. The reason Adar doesn't just ignore the Southlanders and go straight for the win is the same reason the Southlanders abandoned all military and survival tactics. Because the riders wanted a nighttime battle scene with cavalry arriving at the break of dawn, and then the twist MacGuffin usage. Doesn't matter how we got there. Now, I'm not saying you can't write the story backwards. Every prequel writer has to do that. The point is that a good writer would then take that story and make it believable forwards. If there are a multitude of easy, simple solutions to what the characters are doing, and they choose to die instead of taking the easy solution, that is bad writing. In conclusion, the plot is ponderous and meandering the majority of the time, and then a manic sprint at the end. The characters are puppets with no agency, who move according to what the plot needs them to do to get to the next set piece, not because it's the logical thing to do. The cultures presented in this high age of men, elves, and dwarves are sociopathic and callous. The world is tiny, and the greatest sin of all, the show is boring. The Room by Tommy Wiseau is similarly bizarre and nonsensical, yet clearly the work of someone who is extraordinarily passionate about the material. For all of The Room's multitude of faults, it endures, because the director's incompetent sincerity still shines through. The Rings of Power is incompetent and nonsensical, also helmed by leads who have never made a movie before, except that they had infinite money and not one drop of sincerity or passion. This is going to be the most expensive flash in the pan of history, with no cultural impact past the month. If you haven't seen it, I will tell you what I told my friends. If you want to see the show, skip straight to episode 8. Otherwise, start at 6 if we're being generous. Because overall, my rating on this is Fondant out of 5. Okay, so there's this one scene in particular that shows how the writers have so little life experience. So Isildur, he takes a bite out of an apple, gives the horse a tiny bite, and then chucks the rest of the apple off the ship into the ocean. Now, if you've never fed a horse before, I will let you know now. You have to be careful, because the horse will eat the whole apple in one bite. It'll just inhale the thing, like core and seeds and all. The horse doesn't care, they love it. Now, if you never touched a horse before and won't listen to those stinky people who have, you wouldn't know. But, yeah, clearly these writers have never been around the things that they're writing about. Also, like, a horse riding 2,000 miles over 6 days, are you kidding me? It'll just die. It's just straight up. That horse is dead. I don't care how healthy it was.